But during World War II, this was all just disrupted. You had fighting all over Europe, North Africa, and also Japan attacking China. So the whole network of heroin manufacture and trade was, well, dismantled. But this soon changed. And it was aided by the CIA taking over for the OSS. And the first year it existed, 1947, the CIA was having a supposed anti-communist campaign, and they helped the Mafia seize total power in Sicily, and also sent money to heroin-smuggling Corsican mobsters in Marseille, because they were battling against communist unions for the control of the city docks. Isn't this interesting? And infuriating. Corsicans had been dealing for at least 10 years, going back to 1937. That was Paul Carbone's operation there. You might have heard of him. Trafficking lots of illegal heroin abroad, primarily aiming it at the United States. And most of it was coming from Turkey. Turkish farmers were licensed, actually, to grow opium, and they sold it to the legal drug companies, but they didn't sell all of it to them. They had some left over, and they sold it to the underworld, who then would transport it to the United States. Well, first manufacture, then transport it. A lot of the morphine paste was made in Corsican laboratories in Marseille, a very busy port in the Mediterranean Sea. And this heroin was supposedly very good. That's often correlated with the color, by the way, with white being the most pure. And this French underground began participating in a big, big way. And it was on March 17th, 1947, you had 28 pounds of heroin found on the French liner Saint-Tropez. January 7, 1949, more than 50 pounds of opium and heroin seized on the French ship Batista. But then, in 1951, you have a merger essentially taking place with Luciano and the Corsicans, both of whom were helped out by the CIA. You have them pooling their resources, and this would give rise to what would later be called the French Connection. They even made a movie about it. And this connection would dominate the world heroin trade, at least until the early 1970s. This network was just insane. For more than a decade, they were moving all of this morphine base from Middle East into Europe. They transformed into heroin and then exported it just all over the place, mainly United States. And they did not get interrupted very often. They made a killing. Huge distribution network, very well organized. You had active addicts at a level of about 20,000 at the close of World War II. That reached about 60,000 in 1952, and then 150,000 by 1965. And that was going to explode through the roof, coming very soon, especially related to the Vietnam War. But let's stay with this narrative here with the French Connection. You had Luciano sending it through all these different routes to the United States. Because not all of the people that were expelled from the United States actually stayed in Sicily. He had them all over, places like Milan, Hamburg, Paris, Marseille, and they would just forward the heroin on to the United States after it came in from Sicily. Fruits, vegetables, candy, packed with all of this. And it was smuggled through Canada and Cuba, New York, and it was done mainly by some of his underlings. They were some really top guys in the mob. Meyer Lansky in particular. He was the guy managing this huge financial empire. And he was instrumental in organizing the heroin syndicate. And that's one of the reasons he was really down in Cuba. He was working with the Florida-based Trafficante family in particular. Luciano, Lansky, and Trafficante, they were the hookup. They were moving lots of heroin together. And actually, Luciano was living in Cuba for a little while before the United States put a lot of pressure on, and he left again. So, okay. I came a little too close. Okay, I understand. But Luciano, Trafficante, they were putting a lot of money into hotels and casinos in Cuba. But 1959 comes around, Fidel Castro takes over, and this broke Lansky's heart. Oh, he put so much money into that. Yeah, he built up Las Vegas. That wasn't originally necessarily a Jewish-run operation. I don't think it was. But it was almost nothing. It was a blip on the map. And then when Jews came in, they turned it into this city of sin that it is today. Oh, thanks, Jews. Meyer Lansky was huge in that. Casino makes it pretty obvious, the movie with Robert De Niro as the Jew there. I mean, this is pretty much common knowledge. They own it, run it all today, from Steve Wynn to Adelson. It's just, that's the Trump administration for you. We'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that here. So the Cuban Revolution forced him out, and it also forced out a lot of other Cubans. So they decided to make some lemonade. All these criminal Cuban contacts that they had essentially took over the organized distribution networks. No, they didn't violently take it over. They were used as the front men to run all of these different operations. The Mafia employed Latin couriers to set up new routes, and they were bringing in all of this heroin through Miami and through Latin America, and they were using these Cubans and South Americans. And you had Operation Eagle taking place in 1970 with a bunch of raids, nabbing a bunch of people, and it showed all these different Spanish-speaking ringleaders. So people might have thought, hey, the Mafia gave up the business. No. They just distanced themselves from it. It was actually 1960 that the big French Connection bust, the first one, took place. And you had an informant telling a drug agent in Lebanon that the Guatemalan ambassador to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg was smuggling morphine from Beirut to Marseille. So the narcotics agents acted on this tip and seized about 200 pounds of heroin. Narcotics agents had been seizing about 200 pounds of heroin in a year, but you had Corsican traffickers apparently smuggling 200 pounds every other week. So narcotics agents were getting about 200 pounds a year. Well, the traffickers were doing 200 pounds a week. Rosal alone in 1 year had used his diplomatic status to bring in about 440 pounds. So that was the Guatemalan ambassador. 440 pounds of heroin he was smuggling. There were arrests throughout Italy and other places in Europe, and there was warfare between the old and the new mafiosi in Italy. The different styles of conducting business. Some consider themselves much more learned than those old buffoons or whatnot. But the biggest problem that they'd probably face would be Luciano dying. He was in some hot water. They were coming after him, apparently. So we're told. And so we're told he died. Maybe he didn't really. Supposedly he died while drinking a cup of coffee at Naples Airport, 1962. He suffered a fatal coronary attack. He was actually supposed to meet up with somebody about some film, some documentary. I don't even know what the deal was with that. He probably was whacked. You think? Or they faked it? I don't know. Sounds a little suspicious. But the death of the man who had really organized the whole trade after the war and before, he was a huge loss. I mean, he had made about 150 million at least worth of heroin trade into the United States over 16 years. But they were able to continue on, but they had some setbacks, especially with the Mediterranean smugglers. with all of the increased international law enforcement efforts, which came about because they realized what this French connection was all about, how much was being moved. Now, I think some of the people higher up in the government knew all about it and were letting it occur, but it seemed to come as something of a shock, and, well, they started upping their enforcement. It was actually in Turkey where the biggest setback for them came, because the Turkish government said they wanted to reduce and eventually abolish opium production. And the U.S. government actually helped them to do so. They gave them $3 million to form a 750-man police narcotics unit. Okay, we'll talk more about this and much more on the other side. Welcome back. Let's finish up this mob talk here and get on to the wars and how the big business of heroin was taken over by the U.S. government. Well, still working with the same mafia connections as well, but oh man, the devastation that has been wrought by the United States military and them securing these different heroin trade routes and being involved in the business themselves. They're actively involved in heroin cultivation and transit, smuggling. Look at where the heroin's coming from, Afghanistan. But okay, let's go back to where were we? 1967, Turkish opium. They cut it off, right? So they had to find a new source for the material, and that's why we see the rise of the Golden Triangle, which is over there in Asia. I mean, they've gone back and forth, right? But the Golden Crescent closes down a bit, and the Golden Crescent is in the Middle East. And then it opens back up with Afghanistan. It goes back and forth. It's very easy to grow opium, poppies actually, and you don't need to grow all that much to sustain quite a bit of demand. So we had heroin really flooding the American streets. Not in the level it is today, perhaps, but yeah, it was pretty high. The French connection was still there. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1960 said that from 2,600 to 5,000 pounds of heroin were coming into the United States annually from France. It's a decent amount. Up to 5,000 pounds a year. By 1969, they were supplying the U.S. with 80 to 90% of its heroin. That was the French connection. Speaking of this French connection, a lot was being dealt by Jewish gangsters here in the United States. One man in particular was notorious for slinging heroin. That was Herbie Sperling, big dealer of the 1960s and 70s on the East Coast. He worked with his Jewish partners out of the famous stage delicatessen, moved hundreds or maybe thousands of kilos of heroin from the Italian Mafia to the through the French connection, and then on to black and Latin dealers in New York. He had a very foul mouth, was very violent, and he was working for one of the most dangerous mob bosses, Vito Genovese, of that Genovese crime family. He was swept up, along with 17 others, arrested, indicted, tried, and sentenced. He got life plus 30 years. He was actually one of the first drug traffickers to get a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But while he was in prison, he would still serve an important function here. In 1977, he was indicted for hiring 3 black inmates to murder a mobster named Vincent Papa. Now, Vincent Papa's connection to the French connection is very interesting. He had actually orchestrated the theft of around 400 pounds of heroin and cocaine, which had been seized by the police. So that was about $70 million worth of drugs, including that famous French connection heroin, were removed from the New York police evidence room, which was essentially their Fort Knox. Bomb-proof walls, castle-strength doors. They used a fake policeman, and then Papa had the drugs replaced with flour taken out. So they had a fake policeman go in, sign in to the evidence room, switch out the heroin with flour, and they stole the French connection back to the Mafia. Supposedly the biggest robbery in American history. It was discovered that in 1972, Papa had actually cooperated with law enforcement and ratted out some crooked cops so that he wouldn't be taken in. But eventually he was arrested himself. But this had caused a great suspicion about whether or not he would run his mouth, I guess, and that's why Herbie Sperling wanted him whacked. So they said he had to go. 2 black inmates were convicted, but Herbie Sperling, he was acquitted of conspiracy, and he just an awful guy. Looking into some of these guys, you look at them, you think, oh, geez, look at the Purple Gang. Ridiculous. So let's finish up with the Mafia by talking about what happened to some of these big guys, right? Meyer Lansky, 1970. He had spent 5 decades being a leading figure in the heroin business, pretty much being the guy orchestrating it all. He was able to do this for 5 decades. But eventually he had to flee to Israel because he was escaping tax evasion charges in the U.S. Now, as that Myron Sugarman had mentioned, Jewish gangsters had sent large amounts of money and weapons to Israel, and in particular to the Jewish terrorist organization known as Irgun. Meyer Lansky had let these weapons be shipped from the New York City harbor all the way over to Israel, or Palestine, rather. But since Meyer Lansky was pretty much known as being this huge crime boss, Golda Meir decided to say, hey, the scandal's a little too much. Lansky, you have to go back. So after 2 years in Israel, Lansky went back and was acquitted of charges in 1974. Wow, yeah, you're free to go. He led a very quiet life, I guess, in his last years because he was being tailed constantly, always monitored. The money that was made off of all of this heroin trade was invested by these businessmen into their legitimate operations, the casinos in Las Vegas, run by the Jewish gangsters. Also into Hollywood, where you have Jews, gangsters, and gangster Jews being glorified all the time, along with pushing all the mind control agendas and having rap music and all in the movies that glorify the different drug use and whatnot. And they also work with the U.S. government there, which is obviously infiltrated by the Mafia, as I've mentioned, working with them hand in glove. And it really could have been the initial government regulations were intended to bring about the rise of organized crime in this country. They handed them a monopoly on the illicit drug trade. Meyer Lansky works out a deal with the United States government to protect the port from those evil Nazis in order to free Lucky Luciano, who then is sent abroad to organize a massive industrial heroin operation with the backing of CIA operatives and the Corsican mobsters who were themselves helped by the CIA. So the U.S. was apparently fine with all that, all the heroin smuggling coming through the ports of America, which they knew were controlled by the mob, but they just couldn't do anything about it, I guess. They just couldn't seem to figure out how to stop the epidemic of heroin smuggling and usage. Some objective, real, decent police work did lead to the bust of the French Connection, but hey, that can dry up and blow away. Plenty of other trafficking routes would be developed. And they come about as a direct consequence of America's wars abroad. The military becomes the mob. The Mafia's post-war heroin operation in general was aided by the U.S. efforts against communism, apparently. In Asia, Let's move to the Golden Triangle here. The U.S. forged alliances with different tribes and warlords who were part of this Golden Triangle. It was Laos, Thailand, and Burma, where the heroin was being grown. So they provided accessibility and protection along the southeast border of China. Oh yeah, let's deal with China for a second. The revolution in China, Mao's Cultural Revolution, the way that they dealt with Chinese addiction was they just murdered anybody, I guess even suspected of using opium. So through fear, they were able to stop opium use, it seems. Oh, but look at the cost. How many tens and tens and tens of millions dead in that? And what kind of world do they live in? Look at what happened to all their traditions as well. Yeah, communism, not our friend. No, don't believe that communist solutions or the Duterte model is the way to deal with this. Okay, back to the United... How about we just don't have a government that is actively smuggling heroin into our country? How about that? So the U.S. wanted to maintain relationships with these warlords, and the U.S. and France actually gave the warlords and their armies, the ammunition, arms, and even air transport for moving opium. So a lot of heroin was available in the United States, and addicts just couldn't get enough. Actually, in the 60s, there was a perception that people had to leave the cities because of all the crime that was being caused by heroin addiction. This is part of white flight. It's all tied together here. May 1970, a Christian Science Monitor correspondent reports that the CIA is cognizant of, if not party to, the extensive movement of opium out of Laos, quoting one charter pilot who claims that opium shipments get special CIA clearance and monitoring on their flights southward out of the country. At the time, some 30,000 U.S. servicemen in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. That was actually entered into the congressional record by Congressman John Conyers, which was part of A Tangled Web, a history of CIA complicity in drug international trafficking. They've known about this for so long. They even have a History Channel documentary about it, America's War on Drugs. And it was done by Anthony Lapp, who says there's a huge story to be told about the actual extent of U.S. government's involvement in drug trafficking. He goes on to say, Nixon declares famously this war on drugs in June 1971. At the same time, there was a massive heroin epidemic that really was ravaging mostly the eastern seaboard. What a lot of people don't realize is that, too, in part, you could argue another case of blowback from our own operations. During the mid-60s to late 60s, there was a war against communist forces in Vietnam, but also next door there was a gigantic secret war happening in Laos that officially we're not supposed to be fighting. Both politically, it was radioactive for Johnson to declare another front, but there was also treaties that said that we couldn't have troops on the ground both with Laos, and we had an agreement, a sort of tacit agreement, with the Soviet Union. They wouldn't put troops on the ground. There was a massive clandestine CIA operation in Laos running this secret war. People have probably heard of this CIA airline called Air America. Basically, we go into business helping a local warlord named Vang Pao. When we started the war in the mid-60s, around 65, Vang Pao was a sort of somewhat populist, anti-communist leader of the Myong Hill people in Laos, and was peripherally involved in growing opium because that's really what the cash crop was in that area. By 1968, 1969 into 1970, Vang Pao was the biggest heroin trafficker on the planet. Some of his partners were the Sicilian mobsters that he had gone into business, or that we had gone into business to put in Havana, Cuba. Hey, I didn't do it. This we that he's using here. To put into Havana, Cuba, and South Florida to try to kill Fidel Castro. Basically, we had created this huge network or aided this huge network of international drug trafficking that created a massive heroin epidemic, which has only been surpassed by the current opioid crisis, and we go into that later. What happens is, there's all this heroin in the theater of war in Southeast Asia. A lot of troops are getting hooked. Famously, they all start bringing this heroin back, and heroin really starts devastating the inner city. And there was a legitimate belief by a lot of people that really it was out of control and crime rates were really skyrocketing, especially in cities like New York. So Nixon was under a lot of pressure. He had run in 1960 under the banner of law and order, and the country was literally falling apart by 1971 in his eyes. Yeah, so you had this trade moving, between the Golden Crest and the Golden Triangle. Even Mexico was growing. Mexican mud is what they called it. Not very good, not very desirable, apparently. No, it was good, but you get what I'm saying. So some people could figure out. Apparently, others couldn't really get a grasp on it. You had the former chief of police of the USA, Joseph D. McNamara, writing in National Review, "It's the money, stupid. After 33 years, Masonic as hell, as a police officer in 3 of the country's largest cities, that is my message to the righteous politicians who obstinately proclaim that a war on drugs will lead to a drug-free America. About $500 of heroin or cocaine in a source country will bring in as much as $100,000 on the streets of an American city." Whoa. $500 worth of heroin in a source country turns into $100,000 of heroin on the streets of an American city. All the cops, armies, prisons, and executions in the world cannot impede a market with that kind of tax-free profit margin. It is the illegality that permits the obscene markup, enriching drug traffickers, distributors, dealers, crooked cops, lawyers, judges, politicians, bankers, businessmen. Isn't that the truth? Miles Ambrose, one of the President Nixon's closest advisors with this war on drugs, he ended up being somewhat scathing in his judgment of his fellow drug warriors. He said the basic fact that eluded these great geniuses was that it takes only 10 square miles of poppy to feed the entire American heroin market, and they grow it everywhere. That's why they just move the source country from one place to another. He said it takes only 10 square miles of poppy to feed the entire American heroin market. Well, now with Americans all hooked on opioids, you couldn't do it with just 10 square miles, but you get the point. As I mentioned, all these American soldiers hooked on heroin. And when they came back, these guys, because they got hooked on heroin when they were over there in Vietnam, well, they were denied all sorts of VA benefits. Oh, no, you're the one in breach of your contract. We're not going to help you, you junkie. Get out of here. Terrible travesty. And, of course, we know about the heroin being shipped back in the coffins. But after the Vietnam War, heroin stopped coming out of that Golden Triangle. And the CIA set up bases near Afghanistan in the late 1970s. Then you had the rise of the CIA asset Osama bin Laden helping to train the warlords who were planting the poppies. I mean, this is all actually pretty well documented. Let's turn to Ron Paul, 1988. He seems to be a Mason. I think he threw his election bids, and I don't trust him. But he speaks some truth here. It's very interesting looking back at this little time capsule from 1988.
Let's talk about what could be the most explosive issue of this campaign if the mass media would get a hold of it and do something about it, but they're covering it up. And that is you were talking about the government involvement in drugs. There have been government investigations, there have been private investigations, and we've interviewed a lot of people, ex-CIA people, who have talked about the CIA involvement in drug operations for many decades. It's public knowledge, though once again the media are not saying anything about it, that Oliver North and his people involved with the Contras have been running drug operations, cocaine primarily, bringing it back into the United States. And there are other investigations which show that George Bush's office, Donald Gregg particularly, and the people he was working with, have been supervising an enormous drug operation, which once again was sending illegal arms down to the Contras and elsewhere, and bringing cocaine and other types of drugs back into the United States. But neither the Democrats aren't talking about this. Now, are the Libertarians talking about this, and do they put this into the framework of the drug law situation that you're talking about?
We talk about a whole lot. Of course, we always have the trouble of getting the attention that we think it deserves. There have been a few Democrats have talked about it. Senator Kerry's office has done some work.
He's done a lot of the investigation.
Right, and I think he's on to something, and I think we've gotten some other information, too, of course, that the CIA has given Noriega over the years $200,000 a year.
Oh, yes.
And they kept feeding him money, even when Bush was the head of the CIA. I think George Bush is deep into it, well over his head. Somebody asked me once if I thought George Bush knew about as much was going on as Ronald Reagan. I think George Bush knew a lot more about what was happening in the CIA, because I think Reagan was probably more removed from it. I mean, just by his own personality and maybe his age or something. But I think George Bush, through his office and through the fact that he was a member of this, head of the CIA, I think he was very, very close to it. He knows exactly what was happening, and I believe the rule that once a CIA member, always a CIA member. And I think it's awful interesting. Can you imagine? It would alarm a few of us in this country if all of a sudden we knew that the leader in the Soviet Union would be the head KGB agent, and here we take...
Wait, no, that's actually the case right now, and people love it. Putin, KGB man.
Our head CIA agent and put him, potentially the head of our entire country. Unfortunately, I wish that we could get this information out, and I continue to talk about it, but I sadly believe that there will be very little said, which means that the Democrats aren't doing it. That means they're involved too.
They're involved also.
And I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, it was even some of it got reported in the Iran-Contra scandals. We did know that there were drugs involved, and they were selling drugs back and forth. I think that might be the number one reason for the drug laws. I mean, they use and play on the good people of America to support them, but I think the number one reason is not to have high prices for some two-bit drug dealer, as much as to raise the funds necessary for governments to do illegal things, whether it's some terrorist government someplace or whether it's our own CIA to fund programs that they can't get Congress to fund. I think it's tragic, and the sooner we get rid of the drug laws, the sooner this would end.
All right. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that we just need to get rid of all drug laws, but that's an interesting clip. And he was talking largely about the CIA cocaine run operations. They're running cocaine right out of Central and South America. They made a movie essentially glorifying this, American-made, starring Tom Cruise, where you have the CIA pilot flying whatever he could put onto his plane that the U.S. government wanted him to, whether it was the Contras themselves who he brought up to Arkansas to train, where about half of them just ran off because they made it to America. They didn't really believe in the cause. And you had him flying lots of cocaine. He got very rich off of the cocaine trade. A lot of this cocaine was being put out in the form of crack cocaine in the 80s in L.A., Ricky Ross being the big dealer, and he came out and said, hey, I was working with the government agents doing this. Yeah, they helped them all out. This was big, big business, and it was being used to fund these black budget operations, the deep state, if you will. But let's not get too mixed up in the cocaine story, because we're dealing with opioids and heroin here. The Gary Webb revelation and his subsequent murder, supposed suicide, very interesting tale I encourage people to look into. Now, we had Afghanistan really being opened up, but the forces of opium, heroin trading, they had been in Afghanistan for a while. I'm speaking of the British government in particular, the British Empire. I found it very interesting when I was watching, when I was reading Sherlock Holmes. They might not mention this in any of the film or TV show adaptations, but Dr. Watson was originally injured in Afghanistan. He mentions how I think injured his leg when he was serving as a redcoat in Afghanistan. Probably late 1800s, would that be? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Oh, what piece of garbage. Oh, yeah, so isn't it interesting with the Yiddish British Empire, with the poppy being used as this memorial symbol to the fallen, right? It was adopted by the Royal British Legion as a symbol for their poppy appeal in the aid of those serving the British Armed Forces in 1921. That's when they started using the poppy. Oh, come on. Can it be any more obvious? And look how they rub it in their faces. This is what you died for. Poppies. So that your people could be destroyed. Look at the British people. Destruction. Multi-generational heroin use. And some of you out there want to just kill the victims of this. Oh, Duterte's got it right. Duterte's killing the victims. Yeah, okay. Drug traffickers, that's a different story. But is he really going after the big international drug traffickers? No, obviously he is not. He's talking about, you can go rape their women, and anybody I don't like is a terrorist, so I'm going to terrorize them. It's just the old it's just like the United States would be if they really had their way.
They have these opium fields, and we are tolerating it. We are tolerating the cultivation of the opium because we know that if we were to destroy it now, the population would turn against the Marines, and it would be a real security risk. Let me introduce Lieutenant Colonel Brian Christmas. He's the commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines. Really a wonderful group of Marines here. I know that you care deeply about this contradiction, the fact that here you have one of the best fighting forces in the world ever mounted, and in a sense, you're watching as this opium is being grown. I know it grinds at your gut. How do you deal with it? What are you doing about it?
Well, frankly, this is a part of their culture. So while it might grind in my gut, it's what they do.
It's what they do. It's part of their culture. Providing the United States with our massive heroin supply, it's part of their culture. How is it with the United States occupying Afghanistan that all of this opium is flooding out of the country? I mean, part of it's part of that legal business. Do you understand the operation that they set up? Yes, by this point, I think you have. I don't need to hammer it home anymore. You could go watch that famous Geraldo clip. I forget when it's from. Yeah, U.S. soldiers seen openly guarding the fields. And then you hear some of these reports coming from different people within the country and CIA officials, and they're saying, there's some of them blowing the whistle saying, yeah, look, the CIA is doing it. We're over there involved in all of these operations. And isn't it just so interesting that this recent surge, the U.S. troop surge overseen by Donald Trump, coincides with the poppy output hitting record highs? Yes, it's huge. It's huge. Bigly. The heroin supply in the country, it's increased bigly. Everything's going up. It's great. While Trump says that he's going to restore law and order and go after the opioid epidemic. Yeah, right. So they're saying that they increased the fighting force to about 14,000, and that coincided with cultivation going up to a new record high. Let's read this here. This is from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and Afghanistan's Ministry of Counter-Narcotics. It's a report that says the total area under opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan was estimated at 328,000 hectares in 2017, a 63% increase of or 127,000 hectares more compared to the previous year. A 63% increase in 2017, coinciding with this surge. This level of opium poppy cultivation is a new record high and exceeds the formerly highest value recorded in 2014 by 104,000 hectares, or 46%. Strong increases were observed in almost all major poppy cultivating provinces. Yeah, of course it's related. Of course. Let's talk about what Donald Trump's role in this all really seems to be. Yeah, he's talking about the Duterte model for controlling this. He's at the top of this criminal cabal right now. Let's look at his past. Let's see the criminal connections. They're all there staring you in the face. I will try to get to these callers. Mafia Don's Murky Past. This is out of an article titled A Mafia Don with a Pompadour, coming from New Eastern Outlook. I'm not necessarily endorsing the site. I see Veterans Today in the sidebar. But this is all legitimate here. Starting with this section, Mafia Don's Murky Past. Presidential candidate Trump prefers the grandiose, and this is of course dated, prefers the grandiose titular name The Donald. In reality, to be honest, to his background, it should be called the Mafia Don, as in Don Corleone in the movie The Godfather. Trump's past is so intertwined with organized crime, it's incredible that the hand-wringing GOP anti-Trump establishment or Hillary Clinton have not smeared it across every newspaper in America. Now, Trump was born just after the end of World War II in Jamaica, Queens, New York, some 70 years ago. He was son of Fred Trump, a major New York real estate and construction developer. It was well known to every taxi driver or bar owner that for anyone to be a success in New York construction, he had to be on friendly terms with the mob, then and today, just like those who run the garbage disposal businesses or control the harbors. Fred Trump's son Don left business school to join Daddy, Fred's construction and real estate business in New York City. Trump's early mentor in the ways of doing slick, shady construction business in New York was one of the sleaziest characters in New York, a lawyer named Roy Cohn. Cohn, once lawyer for the sleazy U.S. Senator Joe McCarthy. And listen, I agree with some of the stuff he did about the anti-communist stuff, but look at who he was working with, Roy Cohn. Roy reportedly shaped McCarthy's insane paranoid campaign against unnamed communists in the State Department in the early 1950s. I don't think it was insane. Cohn's biographer, Nicholas von Hoffman, noted that Cohn lived in a matrix of crime and unethical conduct, derived a significant part of his income from illegal or unethical schemes and conspiracies. His ties to the mob are so close that he allowed top mafia bosses like Frank Costello to hold their meetings in his law office so they could claim lawyer-client immunity privilege. Cohn, who was pronounced dead of AIDS in 1986 and was described by Hoffman as the best-known non-show business homosexual in the country, was the attorney for a notorious cocaine-snorting Manhattan nightclub in the 1970s called Studio 54. That's Steve Rubel he's talking about there. Hoffman wrote of the orgies at Studio 54 held by Cohn. For special celebrities, the wildest parties were held in the basement, with high society's homosexuals, transsexuals, and transvestites. Cohn held some of the biggest birthday bangs, attended on at least one occasion by the important officials of the Democratic, Republican, and Conservative parties, most of the city's major elected officials, a number of congressmen, the chief judge of the United States District Court, and Roy's usuals, including Donald Trump. Donald Trump and organized crime lawyer Roy Cohn and cocaine orgies in the basement of Studio 54, attended by judges and politicians of every party. In an interview, Trump even described one such Studio 54 orgy he attended. And this is a quote. "I would watch supermodels getting screwed, well-known supermodels getting screwed, on a bench in the middle of the room. There were 7 of them, and each one was getting screwed by a different guy. This was in the middle of the room." This guy's Trump and the casinos in Atlantic City. And there's always been lots of mob meetings at Trump casinos. And I mean, obviously, this is the world of Trump. Casinos, mobsters, Jews, and drugs, and all sorts of degenerate, destructive things like that. Resorts International actually financed the New Jersey referendum that made casino gambling legal in one city in the state, which was Atlantic City, which they tried to build up. It was a mob operation. That's what Trump was doing, was working with the mob to build up Atlantic City at that point. I mean, he's been in their pocket for quite some time. Oh, but you think he's so independent because he has all this money. Well, even if he is the real Mafia Don, I mean, do you think that... I mean, he's constrained. He's constrained by being the head of a crime family. I don't think he really is the Don. I think there are many people towering behind Trump. Well, let's continue with this article for a little bit more. In 1991, Trump and his Atlantic City Trump Plaza Casino came into trouble with the New Jersey Casino Control Commission about his dealings with Robert Labuti, a high-rolling gambler and horse breeder who was later banned from Atlantic City for his ties to mob boss John Gotti. When asked about the Labuti tie, Trump retorted, as he always does, that he couldn't recall the name. He told the Philadelphia Inquirer, when questioned about his relation to Labuti, "I have heard he's a high roller, but if he was standing here in front of me, I wouldn't know what he looked like." The problem is that Labuti's daughter, Edith Creamer, said that he's a liar. Of course he knew him, that she flew on Trump's helicopter with him, and all sorts of things up and down Atlantic City. Of course, they were very, very close, but Trump, he does this when questioned about Felix Sater or about Jeffrey Epstein. Oh, I can't. Who? Oh, no, sir, the guy you called a great guy who likes his women on the younger side just, a decade ago. Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. But if I saw him in a room, I wouldn't even know him. Actually, how he pleaded ignorance on David Duke as well, when he mentioned that's why he would not be involved with Pat Buchanan in his... he called Pat Buchanan a Nazi, and also said that David Duke was... What party was that? Was that the Libertarian Party? I forget, but... yeah, in any event, this is what he does. He pretends like he doesn't know them. Deny, deny, deny. That's what they're all about. But this wasn't all. Not just Robert Labuti tied to John Gotti. You also have Felix Sater. Yes. In 2010, the Don appointed Felix H. Sater, a.k.a. Satter, an executive at Bayrock Group, LLC, to be Trump's senior business advisor, with an office next to Trump's and Trump business cards. Sater's Bayrock had partnered with Trump on the Trump Soho High-Rise Hotel in Manhattan and other branded luxury real estate deals. Sater had pleaded guilty in 1998 to racketeering for his role in a $40 million stock fraud scheme involving the Genovese and Bonanno crime families. Genovese, huh? When an AP reporter questioned Trump about Sater in December 2015, the Don replied his usual, "Felix Sater, boy, I have to even think about it. I'm not familiar with him." A spokesman for the Trump Organization acknowledged publicly that Sater worked for Trump after disclosures of Sater's criminal background. Sater is a Russian emigre who emigrated to Brooklyn in 1974. Oh, and he also got some Chabad Lubavitch Man of the Year award. Remember how Myron Sugarman was being promoted at a Chabad meeting? Oh, yeah, the mob, the Jewish mob has done so much for the Jewish community. Felix Sater, What a mensch. What a great man. Yeah. Oh, what a sick, sick world. Okay, I'm gonna rip through this and then take some calls. Get a little water. There's also a story here, this one coming out of Newsweek, about how Trump and his brand developed the Panama Trump Ocean Club International Hotel and Tower, and they made quite a bit of money off of drug and money laundering. Not that they themselves, but they made it from people who were using Trump's facilities. So apparently he wasn't vetting mobsters out properly because, well, they were utilizing his place in Panama. So he's tied to drug trafficking that way as well. But here's the one I really wanted to get to. This one's very interesting and telling. And this is a story out of the Daily Beast. The drug trafficker Donald Trump risked his casino empire to protect. And I've just selected some excerpts from this. This is a very interesting story here. Trump presents himself as the most ardent law and order politician ever. Yet throughout his adult life, Trump sought out and worked closely with more than a score of criminals, including Mafia associates, Russian mob associates, violent felons, con artists, swindlers, and most significant of all, the embezzler and mob associate, Joseph Weisselbaum, a thrice convicted felon. Long ago, when Trump was the big man in Atlantic City, he got his helicopters to bring his high rollers in and out of town through a company called Weisselbaum, to whom he also entrusted maintenance of the Ivana, Trump's personal helicopter. Named it the Ivana. It's so ridiculous. Spy, a satirical magazine that often made fun of Trump, reported that Weisselbaum, at that point a twice convicted felon, personally piloted the Trumps in that copter. Weisselbaum also had another business, importing drugs from Colombia and shipping them from Bradford Motors, a Miami area car dealership he partly owned, to Cincinnati. When Weisselbaum got caught, his case was handled in a most unusual way, with Donald Trump and one of his siblings in starring roles. So law enforcement reports long ago identified Weisselbaum as a Mafia associate. Trump needed helicopters to fly high rollers to Atlantic City. The selection of Damon Aviation was odd, given that was Weisselbaum's company, given that there were better financed helicopter companies with longer track records. Damon was set up as a lightly financed, tax-sheltered operation that benefited from lavish state of New Jersey subsidies. Despite that structure, it soon went bust and reemerged as NEMAD. Damon spelled backwards. It went bust again. Through all of this, Trump stayed with Damon, run by Joseph's brother, and continuing to him instead of switching to any of the other helicopter providers. Because Weisselbaum was then a twice-convicted felon, New Jersey gambling regulators eventually insisted he not be involved with providing helicopter services to the Trump casinos. Hey, Trump, this Weisselbaum, twice-convicted felon, you got to stop using him. Yet Weisselbaum continued collecting a $100,000 salary, more than $220,000 in today's money, and a company car and driver from NEMAD. And Trump kept using the company that paid Weisselbaum even though he was supposedly no longer involved, which technically met the requirements imposed by casino regulators. According to his indictment, Weisselbaum's more lucrative business was having drugs delivered to Bradford Motors, the Miami area car dealership he had an ownership stake in. At one point, he helped load up to 1,500 pounds of drugs at the time into cars that mules drove to the Cincinnati area for distribution in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Testimony in his confessions established. Trump learned of the indictment shortly after it was filed in October 1985, New Jersey Casino Control Commission records show. At that point, Trump should have cut off all connections to Weisselbaum because failing to do so could cost him his casino license. The New Jersey Casino Control Act requires owners to prove by clear and convincing evidence that they do not consort with criminals. The United States Supreme Court upheld this law because a casino license is a privilege, not a right. Instead of abandoning Weisselbaum, Trump did him the first of several favors. 2 months after the indictment, Trump rented apartment 32C in the Trump Plaza Apartments on East 61st Street in Manhattan to the Weisselbaum brothers, according to New Jersey Casino Control Commission records. Trump personally owned the unit. So he put up the Weisselbaums. It was an odd arrangement. The brothers were to pay about half the rent in cash and the rest in unspecified helicopter services, which would be hard to establish without a thorough audit according to those casino regulatory files. Meanwhile, Weisselbaum agreed to plead guilty in federal district court in Cincinnati. His Ohio lawyer, Arnold Morelli, asked that the sentencing be done either in Miami, where Bradford Motors is located, or in Manhattan, where the confessed drug trafficker lived. Instead, the case somehow ended up in New Jersey, and in not just any courtroom either. It came before Judge Mary Ann Trump Barry, Trump's older sister. After 3 weeks, Judge Barry recused herself, explaining to the chief judge that her husband, Trump casino lawyer John Barry, and she had flown in the helicopters of a confessed drug trafficker. Oh, after 3 weeks, she just remembered, I had flown on his helicopter, actually. At the time, there was only a signed order reassigning the case, but not explaining the reasons for doing so. 6 years passed before Barry's reason for recusal, potentially damaging to the federal judiciary, emerged in a book by investigative reporter Wayne Barrett. Then Trump wrote a letter on Trump Organization stationery pleading for mercy for Weisselbaum. He called him a credit to the community. Trump also described the drug trafficker as conscientious, forthright, and diligent, not the sort of language a law and order presidential candidate would be expected to apply to a drug trafficker who moved more than 11 pounds of cocaine in one shipment alone and more than 3/4 of a ton of marijuana in another. When New Jersey gaming regulators first asked Trump about his letter, he denied writing it. When they came back with a copy of the letter, Trump said under oath that his signature was on the page. What else he may have been asked is unknown because the New Jersey Attorney General's Division of Gaming Enforcement's report did not indicate that Trump was asked the obvious question. Trump's letter worked. Weisselbaum served just 18 months, while the mules who merely drove the drugs got sentenced up to 20 years. When time came for parole, Weisselbaum said he had the required job and a place to live. He told authorities he would be Trump's helicopter guy. Then he moved into Trump Tower. Wow. Trump and Weisselbaum. An interesting history there. He's his helicopter service provider. I wonder why he always wanted to use Weisselbaum. You'd think that he's such a savvy businessman that he would just choose the best helicopter service around. Is it because Weisselbaum provided he and his guests with certain offerings, certain drugs for them? Could it be that he just looked the other way? Obviously, this seems to have something to do with it, doesn't it? Let's see, I have this clip here from Rolly Quaid, which I will be playing here, and then bringing on Rolly to talk to him right after it. He sent me this clip, very, very interesting.
Sorry to bore you all with this information, but I just wanted you to kind of see the background of Opioid and how it's connected to the Mafia, and it goes back many decades. But you can see Here, Felix Sater, very good friend of Donald Trump. You see the picture of this sage in the picture here, this Jewish sage here. But then in this picture you see Benjamin Netanyahu speaking with the sage, and he's telling Benjamin Netanyahu, what can you do to forward the coming of their Messiah? Okay? So this person that Benjamin Netanyahu is speaking to in his early years is in this picture with Felix Sater holding the picture. Do you see the Mafia, the Jewish Mafia connection here? Do you see the synagogue of Satan, folks? See how it all... So basically, this Jewish Mafia is infiltrated the United States, and they are basically destroying the Goyim. That's what this is all about. And anybody that's not a Jew, or at least a converted Zionist, is considered Goyim. And they look at us as cattle, or even worse, So they see us as their serfs or their slaves. And if we're not willing to be their serf or their slave, then we're not worthy to live. Some of the worst murderers in history, the worst murderers in the world, are God's own people, the Jews. Sad. The children of Israel, they murdered the prophets that were sent to them. Now, I know a lot of this information that this guy was sharing, it's long and dragged out, and it's probably not the way I would have delivered the message. But to save the time for me to have to go and look all that information up, I thought it would be better just to listen to someone that already has. And I apologize for any words he might have said that were not wholesome words. But folks, you can just see the roots of Donald Trump. He's deeply rooted in the Mafia. If you can't see that by now, he was mentored by Cohn. And Cohn is the most demonic, evil. Just the look of this guy is just like death. Just like a Walking Dead zombie. Like he's no life in him, he's got no soul. And when you do things that they do, and you keep searing your conscience and getting more filled with hate and murder, that's what you'll look like. Why do you think Donald Trump, very, very few times you ever see him smiling? Because of who he's involved with. He puts on a show, or puts on an air, but deep beneath that mask of his is the mask of the Mafia. He's very much involved in crime syndicate, very much involved in organized crime. He tries to keep himself in such a way that nobody can connect him. But he's hanging him his own self. He's hanging his own self. So just watch as he hangs himself, because he's going to. But the opioid, I should say, is nothing more than opium, and it's heroin, it's cocaine, and this, where Donald Trump says he's against drugs and he won't allow, he's kept his children from drugs and he didn't take drugs. Well, if you know anything about the drug cartel, those that push drugs don't take drugs. And the reason they don't take drugs is because they want to keep a level head while the others are on drugs that they're pushing the drugs to. But they themselves never do drugs, just like they that push television, push movies. Their own children don't watch television. See, they feed the Goyim with the very thing they won't partake of themselves. I think it would be hard to find, anybody that's involved in the crime syndicate at the level that Donald Trump's at that does drugs. It's not that he doesn't do drugs because his brother died from alcohol, whatever, or because it's because he's one of those that believes you got to keep a level head. And that's why they don't do drugs. They sacrifice not doing drugs or alcohol so that they can be the ones with the level head in business. And that's how they do it. That's how they roll. But yet, those that work for them and those that they push the drugs on, they're out of their minds. And they want to keep it that way. But a lot of this comes out of Israel. A lot of this comes out of the synagogue of Satan. It's organized crime. Anyway, that's it for this evening. Hope you enjoyed the previous message before this one, this two-part message on opioid. So I hope you got something from the Word of God today, encouraged you. God bless you and good evening.